Hi, everyone. Welcome to another confined edition of The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. The Daily Beast foreign editor, Christopher Dickey, is with us from the French capital. How are you?
I'm good. Beautiful day out today.
And you're able to, of course, walk nearly 100 kilometers. We'll talk about that. Perhaps.
Yeah, I haven't walked 100 kilometers yet.
Okay. Has Pierre Asqui walked 100 kilometers, international affairs columnist for French flagship public radio station France Inter?
Hi, François. Not 100 kilometers, but a few miles. Yes, I went in a forest last weekend. Yes.
All right. Beginning of deconfinement.
Yes.
It's become a household word, deconfinement. It is in the dictionary. It's just seldom used. Liana Misretta is senior correspondent for Italian public broadcaster La Rai. And you're also starting to see the beginning of the end of lockdown for now. How are you?
Yes, good morning. I'm fine. The lockdown is almost to end. There are some new measures in Italy, but still we are almost based in Rome because we cannot move around the country. So I'm here in Rome, but that's pretty better now.
All right, it's getting a little better. And Jake Adelstein to make us all jealous because, well, Japan hasn't had much of a lockdown there. Jake Adelstein, who is the Japan correspondent for The Daily Beast. How are you?
Good. We have had no lockdown. Last weekend, I went to a hot spring resort and ate really good food. And today I walked around and got coffee. The only inconvenience we've had is that, my favorite coffee shop closes at 6 p.m. instead of 11 p.m.
All right, I want to talk to you about Japan in a moment. But first, let me ask Pierre Asqui, because I have not set foot in France 24's headquarters since March the 13th. We're doing some of the shows from the studio, but for health and safety reasons, as much as possible, we're continuing with this kind of setup. I know that you're back at Radio House, as it's called in France, La Maison de la Radio. What's that been like?
It's been really nice feeling to go back to work in a real place and meet colleagues and be physically there. There's a lot of security, obviously, temperature taken at the entrance of the building. Mask is compulsory, not more than 3 people in the studio when they used to be 6. So everything is really very strict, but at least we're getting back to normal or some kind of normal. The new normal is not exactly normal.
Not exactly like the old normal. Christopher Dickey, what we've seen this week in Paris is people are trying to social distance. I'm seeing personally a lot more people with face masks. But the problem is now that you have cars back on the streets, well, people have to share the sidewalk.
Well, they have to share the sidewalk in a way they weren't sharing it before. It used to be when things were more or less totally locked down. If you went out at certain hours, there were runners, but they were running down the middle of the highways, the middle of the street to keep social distance. I think in fact, social distancing is breaking down pretty quickly, not just because of sharing the sidewalk, but people are just tired of it. And I see lots of people who do not have masks on. And after a while, if you're walking around with a mask and you see lots of people who don't have masks on, your first instinct is to say, well, those crazy people are going to spread the disease. Your second instinct is to say, I feel kind of like an idiot wearing this mask. I think that the social peer pressure after a while is going to militate against social distancing. And probably that will have very bad effects over the long run.
Even indoors?
Even indoors. Oh, about social distancing indoors?
No, I'm wearing the masks. You think people are gonna stop wearing them indoors?
Well, I think what you see is, yes, people wear them indoors, but a lot of people wear them below their nose. Some people wear them below their chins, and that doesn't really do any good. If you are exerting yourself, you've probably had this experience. If you're wearing a mask outside and doing any kind of exercise, eventually it becomes hard to breathe through the mask. It gets damp. It starts to close up. These cloth masks do, and oddly enough, you start to feel out of breath. All of which is very unpleasant, and I think is going to militate against mask wearing pretty soon.
Will it be the same in Italy, Liana Mistretta?
Yes, it's pretty similar to Paris. What I'm seeing in Rome since the beginning of last week, when the measures have been eased here in Italy, and we can move around without the need to certify why we are moving around the cities, I'm seeing that there are more people, of course, in the street, and not so many in the historical center of Rome, which is usually overcrowded by tourists, which of course are not in Italy at the moment because it is not possible. But still, there are more people around, not everybody wearing a mask. We are obliged to wear it when we are inside places, public places. And if you go into a post office, for instance, into a clothes market or a shop, you are obliged to wear it. But if you walk around, you are not obliged, but of course you have to respect the social distancing. And in the center of Rome, where there are all those tiny streets, and it is very easy to be close to people, some people, many people do not wear a mask. Others are scared and keep apart. So we see this mixed feeling. Some people behave like if nothing had ever happened, so they do not wear a mask, they go wherever they want. Some other people are pretty scared. That's why many restaurants and coffee shops which have opened actually are deserted. In some areas where young people go out at night, you can see many people around, but in other areas, there are really few people. Imagine that almost 30% of restaurants and cafes in Italy are not going to open anymore because they are afraid not to be able to run businesses like they did before, and because they have to bear many costs to adjust to the new measures. So it's a mixed
cafes, but also the entire tourism industry. You know, we were talking earlier about the new rules where you can go 100 kilometers from home. Liana, I know you're from Palermo in the south. Mm-hmm. You've not been home to see your family since the start of lockdown.
I can't. It's impossible because since March, we are not able to travel between one region and the other. We could also only move in our city, then since last week in our region, but from Lazio, where Roma is and where I'm based because of the TV, I cannot move to Sicily. I will have to wait till the beginning of June, probably, but it is not sure because now in these latest hours, the Italian government is discussing, there is a big debate. We have to wait at the end of May to see if these measures are working. And only after they will decide if we can move from one region to the other. So I will be able to go and visit my family to Palermo. But there is also a possibility, Francois. Maybe it will be possible to move only to one region to the other, which has a similar case of contagions. Let's say Lombardia, which is the most hit, people from Lombardia will not be able to go to Lazio or to Sicily or to Sardinia. It is still under discussion.
Still under discussion. Jake, you were gloating at the outset that you haven't had any lockdown in Tokyo. You've written stories very critical of the Japanese government's half-hearted response, shall we say, to testing, and it seems, could it be that they're getting away with it when you look at the numbers?
Well, there's definitely not a lot of people dead, and even if they're hiding data and not doing testing, it's hard to hide a lot of people dying. And the reasons that Japan has been sort of semi-successful with their half-assed measures, not successful if you're comparing them to Taiwan, where they only had 7 people dead, or even South Korea, which had much fewer people dead. Japan has always been a kind of mass culture long before this started. It's because hay fever season, which coincided with COVID-19, is a time when everybody's wearing masks in Japan. So they have masks all the time. People are used to wearing masks. I have here, and plus Japanese masks are really well made. So this is like not a cloth mask. This is one you would get for allergies and stuff. And you can wear this and run in it, and you're pretty much fine. It's very light. It's very airy. It's very well designed. These are the terrible cloth masks that the Prime Minister Abe had distributed for millions of dollars that people are throwing away. I have mine that the government gave me. It only made it up to 10% of the population. But it's an interesting thing in Japan, and maybe that has had some effect, is people don't have resistance to masks. And you see people wearing masks in Japan all the time, long before this happened.
And you wrote a story this week about how, well, people have been going off for lovers' trysts through it all.
Yeah, the only thing in Japan that has, been, selling well or holding firm have been sales of condoms, love hotels, and masturbatory devices, because a lot of people in Japan are, quarantining alone. But in Tokyo, the kind of thing that's ironic is that there is this stigma about going out in public still. You're kind of shamed if you do it, so people go to the suburbs and go to love hotels because they're bored. They're not going to work.
All right, in Japan, so they're definitely bucking the trend. And while we're all busy talking about COVID-19, China, perhaps a little bit under the radar of the international community this Friday, effectively saying with a new security law that it may be curtains for Hong Kong's special status that's due to run until 2047. The ruling National People's Congress at its opening unveiling this security law, which under vague rules will allow for the arrest of dissidents of all sorts. Immediately, there have been protests in Hong Kong where the pro-democracy movement fears a fresh assault.
The imposition on Hong Kong, the national security law by the National People's Congress, is obviously, Xi Jinping had torn away the whole pretense of one country, two system. So they are announcing to the world that Hong Kong is no longer under one country, two system. It is now one country, one system, when they can impose the law on Hong Kong.
Pieraski, is he right? Is it over for Hong Kong's special status?
I think so, because in effect, the fact that they introduced this law in Beijing, in the National Assembly and not in the local assembly in Hong Kong, is a clear violation of Hong Kong's autonomy. And it's a retaliation for the constant harassment that China feels coming from the US administration and from Donald Trump himself. So their reaction has been to show that they don't care, they don't get intimidated, and they do something that could have sounded impossible only a few months or a couple of years ago, which is tear down this international treaty, which is guaranteeing Hong Kong's autonomy for 50 years, that was signed when Hong Kong returned to the motherland in 1997. So clearly this is a signal of defiance from China's rulers to the world that, okay, you're attacking us, so we do whatever we want. And the first victim of this new Cold War...
We saw this week how China more than ever needs Hong Kong because with the United States announcing the delisting of Chinese companies from the New York Stock Exchange, a lot of those companies are going to be listed now in Hong Kong itself. They still need that window to the outside world.
Yes, of course, but I think in China, politics come first, nevertheless. Sometimes we feel the contrary, but I think politics come first. And at the moment, the priority is to keep a firm stand in front of Donald Trump and the US administration. And so they feel that the new Cold War is being set up by the US administration. And in that Cold War, you have to choose sides. And Hong Kong has been a thorn in China's foot for months now, particularly since the Pan-Democratic Party and movement has won the local elections in November. So that's the answer today. And I think there's no ambiguity about that answer.
Ricky, the U.S. Senate's already talking about sanctions against China over this. What will be the reaction from Washington?
Are you asking me, François?
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what it's going to be from Washington, but I'm a little bit surprised to hear Pierre say that this is a reaction to Donald Trump. Maybe that's a factor, but I think that Hong Kong has been a thorn in the foot of China for quite a while now because of the people of Hong Kong, because of the mass protests that they've staged again and again, because of their resistance to laws that would have permitted extradition of Hong Kongers to the mainland, because of a whole raft of things, because there's a hell of a lot more freedom of expression in Hong Kong than there is in the rest of China. What this law seems to be doing is essentially extending the Great Firewall of China around Hong Kong, not only to react perhaps to Donald Trump, but to shut down the ability of Hong Kongers to communicate and interact the way they always have for the last many years, and especially in the last couple of years. So I think that's really the problem. In terms of the reaction of Washington, yeah, the Senate and Congress may react. Trump is reluctant to do anything very serious because he doesn't want to screw up his relations with Xi Jinping even more than they are. But I'm not sure that anybody's really capable of doing anything effective.
Liana Misreta, we saw perhaps an underreported story this week. Australia, whose prime minister has been critical of the Chinese since the outbreak of the pandemic, he's having to contend now with sanctions, or tariffs, if you will, on barley exports from Australia to China. And analysts are saying this is a calling card just as much to the European Union, where there are a lot of trade interests between the likes of Germany and your native Italy. Does that mean, of course, that criticism will be muted from this continent?
Well, I think there will be criticism about that. You know, in Europe, especially in Italy as well, but in Europe in general, we are focusing so much on what is happening, between China and the United States, namely, remember the trade war about the tariffs, which is not ended. Of course, Europe has great interests in China, Italy as well. Remember that Italy is one of the few countries which has welcomed the Silk Way, the new Silk Road by China, and has supported it. It will pass through many big ports in Italy. So there is a great interest and a big attention on what is happening in China. And I think what is worrying us is that actually this continuous dispute between the United States and China, this tariff war which is going on, and which is going to include also many other countries such as Australia, as you mentioned, is going to really put at risk economic interests of Europe, of Italy, namely in our case, but also we are worried about the effects that this can have on the stability of the world, because we are seeing how the tension is higher and higher between China and the United States. Of course, we remember this year in the United States, there are presidential elections. Donald Trump is focusing so much toward China. There is this big anti-China sentiment in the United States. Of course, United States are trying to make it a domestic political issue. But what is at stake? It's a world issue. And if frictions get worse, if trade wars becomes more serious, this can have big effects not only on economic relationships between Italy, Europe, and China, but it can have big effects also on the security of the world. This is what we are really worried about.
And as always, and you allude to that, you have the fact that, well, China may be a rival to the United States, but is also a trading partner. So at that National People's Congress, when the Prime Minister gets up to announce there will no longer be growth targets for China, it's also a worry for the West. Let's listen.
This is because our country will face some factors that are difficult to predict in its development due to the great uncertainty regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and the world economic and trade environment.
Jake Adelstein, how's the news of China's slowdown being received where you are?
Well, I mean, it's not only the slowdown is being received with anxious. It's Japan is a staunch defender of Taiwan. They have very good relations. And with Hong Kong being bullied, they're kind of over offenses. Should we speak out for democracy, or should we keep our relations with China very good? And, Japan is really sort of struggling as how to deal with this. Recently, Japan came out and said, Taiwan should be part of the WHO. And that surprised everyone. Wow, Japan has a backbone and will go up against China. And right now it's sort of a critical time because you do have a very conservative faction in Japan that is very anti-China and sort of pro-democracy. So no, right now the government is trying to figure out which side do we take? Do we take the high road, or do we try and just be obsequious and be on good terms with China?
Yeah, Pierre-Ski, your thoughts on that?
No, I think China and the US are actually playing a game that is going to force everybody to take sides. That's what happened during the first Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US in the 50s, and that's happening again today. And to respond to Chris, I think obviously China has wanted to suppress the democratic movement in Hong Kong for months, but it was trying to preserve appearance, to preserve the legality of Hong Kong's autonomy. The fact that it chose a very visible moment, the opening of the assembly in Beijing, to announce this law is really aimed at the international community, saying we're not going to be intimidated, particularly to the US. So I think you have both the domestic Hong Kong problem, but you have China's stand internationally. And at the moment, I think the Chinese have made up their mind that there's not going to be a decrease of tension with the US, certainly not until the elections. Donald Trump is making China bashing his main argument in the election campaign. And so they take the side that they can go on the offensive also.
We're going to move to Europe we'll know pretty soon in the days and weeks to come whether what we heard this week from the German Chancellor was historic or not. Angela Merkel, who in a joint press conference with French President Emmanuel Macron, we could call it even a surprise press conference because it was announced the same day, saying that Paris and Berlin had agreed to a $500 billion aid program for the rest of the European Union, an aid program that would come in the form of grants, not loans.
You must show cohesion. We have to quickly overcome this. This is why we want to have a fund, which of course will be limited in time, but 500 billion euros will be earmarked. These won't be loans. This will be budget spending that will be earmarked to regions and sectors that are hardest hit by COVID. We're convinced that these measures are appropriate, they're necessary. It's important for the European Union to make funds available for several budget years.
Pierre-Ski, Angela Merkel surprised the world in 2015 when she suddenly announced that Germany was going to let in the Syrian refugees. Has she surprised you this time with this announcement?
Yes, I think she did a very bold move because instinctively she's not on that side, the side of those who want to make common loans in the name of Europe. She's a very prudent manager of Germany's economy. And so she jumped into the other side for a very solemn moment. And this, many people have commented that this could be a turning point in Europe's history. It remains to be seen, particularly as some countries, particularly the Netherlands and Austria, are still very reluctant to follow on that road. And we'll see whether there can be a consensus on those lines. But if it comes through, and I believe it will somehow come through, it will be a very significant moment. Angela Merkel has been the key person in this change of tune in Europe, and for some domestic reasons too, because last week the Karlsruhe Constitutional Court in Germany has made some decisions that were seemingly disputing some of the European decisions, and Angela Merkel decided that she had to move faster towards a European goal, and I think she surprised everybody, including in her own country.
You know, Christopher Dickey, how many times on the show have we said in the last couple of years when Germany's been bogged down in more and more political gridlock. Oh, she's a lame duck chancellor. It's already the beginning of the end. And now she's reestablished herself as the clear leader of Europe?
Yeah, Francois, you've said that many times. But in fact, she is looking like she is showing tremendous leadership right now at a moment when tremendous leadership is exactly what is needed. And I think that when you have the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, getting together to break new ground on what is at the center of the European idea, finally, which is money and sharing the wealth, then when they get together on that, then that truly is a historic moment. And I'm very happy, whatever we've said in the past, I'm very happy that Angela Merkel is still there. And once she's gone, it's very hard to imagine who can replace her as the leader of Europe. I'm sorry to say I don't think it will be Macron, much as he aspires to that job.
Liana Mistretra, you agree?
Yes, I agree. And to tell you more, today there is an interview to our Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte published in Corriere della Sera. And Premier Conte is talking about a historical step, the one that Angela Merkel has taken. Conte said that this is going to be really, really important. He talks about the magic Angela Merkel, because if you look at it under an Italian point of view, Italy is one of the countries which in Europe has been hit the most by coronavirus, not only under a health point of view, because we were the first to be hit, we have such a great number of victims and contagions, but under an economic point of view, we were already weak. And with this crisis, the economic crisis triggered by the coronavirus crisis, we are really in great difficulties. And our government had some troubles within its majority alliance to take into account the European stability mechanism. You know that they were talking about that, but in Italy there is a strong resistance to the ESM. The party of 5 stars, which is in the alliance of government, doesn't want it. So in a way, the fact that Germany has accepted this kind of grant, mutual grant, is solving a big problem also to Italian government, because they will avoid this kind of dispute about the European stability mechanism. So Conte is talking about the important turning point, a historic turning point, what he said. And of course, what we see, François, is that Europe, of course, after this coronavirus crisis, will not be the same. The balances will change, and this is a proof of that.
And one of the areas in which Europe was called out was, of course, there is no European healthcare policy. And it's been a bit overlooked in that joint press conference, but Emmanuel Macron wants to blaze new ground on that front.
In terms of health, our wish is to provide Europe with concrete skills in the field of health, joint stocking of masks, tests, purchasing capacity, and joint production for treatments and vaccines, plans for shared prevention of epidemics, common methods to identify cases. This kind of joint health system in Europe has never existed, but it must become our priority.
Pierre Aski, are we seeing the beginnings of a federal Europe, not just on the economic front, but on the public health front?
Federal Europe is going too far. I think the F word is not being used at all. But what is certain is that Europe's history has been using crisis as a way forward. Every time there's been a crisis, it's allowed Europe to move forward. The euro, for example, was the child of German unification and the difficulty to find the legal framework for Germany's unification. And Europe missed the boat with the Greek debt crisis, with the migrant crisis. And this time there's a feeling that we should not miss the coronavirus crisis and try to make Europe better or more workable. Otherwise, we will lose the face of Europeans. And that's what's at the key of the health issue and the money issue. And I agree with Chris, money is at the heart of Europe's mechanism.
And since money's at the heart of it, it's time to bring in this story what's seen by many in Southern Europe as a band of villains, kind of like something out of Marvel Comics. They're known as the Frugal Four. They're led by Austria's Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz. It's the countries of Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. They had a meeting right away when they heard about this proposal. They say they want it to be loans, not grants for this mutualization of debt project. You saw an interview there in the Austrian press by the Chancellor himself. And then if your German's a little rusty, he put out a tweet in English, Sebastian Kurz. Our position remains unchanged. We're ready to help most affected countries with loans. We expect the updated financial agreement to reflect the new priorities rather than raising the ceiling. Christopher Dickey, your thoughts on Sebastian Kurz? Because remember, he was a villain when he was teaming up with the far right. Then he broke with them and was billed as this guy who's grown and matured and became a good guy again in the eyes of many in Southern Europe. And now he's the leader of this Frugal Four.
Well, first of all, let's look at that Frugal Four. We're talking about pretty small countries here. What's the population of Austria? I think it's not much bigger than New York City. I think Sweden, another of these countries, what's its population? 10 million, something like that. The Netherlands is a little bit bigger, of course, but these are small countries. And I think one of the questions that the Frugal Four are raising for the rest of Europe, particularly if they're up against France and Germany and Italy for that matter, and Spain, much more populous countries, is why do they get a veto? Why do they have this kind of power within the European Union? That's the way it's been structured. That's the way it's been structured for a long time. And I don't expect that'll change. But I think that this could backfire against them. There'll be a lot of resentment if they try and hold firm on this and stop this from going forward.
There was another set of tweets by Sebastian Kurz this week. This about trying to bring in those summer tourists. The Germans are welcome. He tweeted in German that time. But he did put out this other tweet where he said, under no circumstances will we open our border to countries that have not yet got the situation under control. Liana Mistretta, just look across the Brenner Pass. I think he's talking about you, Italy.
Yeah, it is, because we are so close, actually, and this is a matter of debate, in the next month when we are going to open up to the rest of Europe and to the other Italian regions. So this will be a problem. I mean, there has been a call on European Union to have common guidelines just to avoid some countries to make up these, this kind of corridors, countries which are allowing tourism between themselves and not with all European countries. And of course, it would be useful to have common guidelines to make the flow of tourists in all the European countries. But let's see what Austria is going to do. I mean, the resentment is quite big, not only for this latest news, but also since the beginning of the crisis. Remember, as I was telling you before, Italy was the first European country to be hit by the coronavirus, although the virus was also already around the other European countries. And yet the call for help by Italy were not accepted by many European countries. Remember the affair about the masks, the protection masks, which were not to be sent to Italy. We didn't receive much support at the beginning. And of course, this has been quite critical. Fortunately, then things have changed. We are seeing a different approach to the crisis. And once again, of course, it will remain to be seen what next month is going to happen when the borders will be opened.
All right, there are European common interests, and there are also national champions. Here in France, one of those is the Renault car company. It was the newspaper, the Canard Enchaîné, this week that first broke the news that it would be closing at least 3 plants, including one that makes the sports car, the Alpine, in the Normandy portside city of Dieppe. There are also talk of restructuring at the biggest plant in the Paris area in Flins. Pierre Haski, the auto industry in this country has been in trouble for a long time. It's had seemed to rebound until this pandemic.
Yes, I think this case is going to be a test for the government, because the government is about to announce 5 billion euro to support Renault in this difficult time. And there's no way the government can provide 5 billion euro to a company that's going to close 3 factories. So there will have to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of bargaining. And I put my money on the fact that not 3 factories will be closed. Maybe the Alpine factory will be closed because the Alpine is a commercial failure. So that's a different matter. But I don't think the government can afford politically to support a company that is closing factories in the country. That's totally impossible.
All right, so car trouble at Renault. And we're still hearing about the former boss of the company. You remember Carlos Ghosn's daring escape from Japan, whereas the head of Nissan, he had been held and then first under arrest and then in house arrest. 2 of his accomplices who helped him escape, allegedly, they have now been detained in the United States. Nicholas Rushworth has more.
Another twist in the Carlos Ghosn saga, with 2 men, Michael Taylor, a former US Green Beret, and his son Peter, arrested in Harvard, Massachusetts in the United States. This is their home. They are wanted in a Japanese arrest warrant seeking their extradition, along with a Lebanese man also suspected of helping Carlos Ghosn flee last December. US prosecutors say they smuggled Ghosn out of his Tokyo residence, where he was under tight surveillance, by hiding him inside a large chest of the kind used to transport audio equipment for concerts. Ghosn fled via private jet from Japan to Turkey and then on to Lebanon, in what Japanese prosecutors describe as one of the most brazen and well-orchestrated escape acts in recent history. A lawyer for the 2 suspects said he expects to challenge any extradition request, adding that Michael Taylor is a distinguished veteran and patriot, and both he and his son deserve a full and fair hearing regarding these issues, both before the courts and the executive branch. In February, Nissan filed a lawsuit to reclaim around $90 million from Ghosn for what it called years of his misconduct and fraudulent activity. The former Nissan chairman says he fled to escape what he sees as a rigged justice system in Japan.
Before I get a judgment.
Jake Adelstein, you reported when there was the escape that it was perhaps in the interest of the Japanese to look the other way when Ghosn went to Beirut. So why this extradition request? Why these arrests?
Well, it's the Japanese government trying to save face. I mean, I don't think they actually really wanted. They don't want Carlos Ghosn back because they would really like to push them behind this. The entire orchestrated plan to take down Carlos Ghosn has destroyed Nissan. And Carlos seems to be right when he said that Nissan will be bankrupt in 2 years. However, they did make the request to the U.S. authorities to have the people who helped him escape be captured, and the U.S. does what Japan asks. I mean, it's a very legally they're within the rights to do it. And I don't think that the Abe administration really wants to hear about Carlos Ghosn anymore because the Nissan thing was a fiasco. But since they've caught the 2, I guess Japan will ask them to be extradited. And they'll save face if they go to jail because, Japan will be like, well, yes, Carlos escaped, but we got the guys that helped him escape. So all is well. And
there still is the number 2 of Nissan, the former number 2, who's being held in house arrest in Japan, Greg Kelly.
Yeah, they're never going to let Greg Kelly go, but I don't think he's going to be found guilty in his court case. And quietly, the prosecutors are trying to figure out a way to sort of make this whole problem resolve itself. It's a blemish on the Japanese government, and I think everyone at the top levels of the government understands that the prosecutors being used to solve what was essentially in-house problems in Nissan was a terrible strategy that has made them look stupid in the world and has probably cost them one of their crown jewels because Nissan is not doing very well. If Renault is doing badly, you can blame Nissan and you can blame the Japanese government, but you can also blame Macron for telling the Japanese authorities that they were going to put Nissan under the control of Renault, which did not play well with the Japanese government.
You agree with that, Christopher Dickey?
Well, I think that probably was a tactical diplomatic mistake and certainly made life more complicated for Carlos Ghosn and for Mr. Kelly. I think just going back to the report on that, one of the things that interested me was the remark that by the lawyers for the Taylors that they wanted to be heard in the courts and by the executive. What does that mean? I suspect it means that they're going to try and drag Donald Trump into this because he's become quite famous for pardoning all kinds of people once there's a kind of political support for them. And the Taylors are the kind of people who might get that kind of political support. They free this man who's a tremendous business executive. They get him out of Japan. And then the first thing they do is they tell you, you know, we're Green Berets, we're patriots. This is all the kind of thing that Americans do. They help out businessmen who are under pressure from a corrupt government. So I think it wouldn't be surprising if Donald Trump gets dragged into this.
All right, and Donald Trump dragged into the Carlos Ghosn affair. We'll see how that pans out. Chris Radicki, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Pierre Aski. I also want to thank Liana Mistretta for being with us from Rome, Jake Adelstein in Tokyo, and thank you for joining us here in ever greater numbers on Facebook, on Twitter, and on our YouTube channel for The World This Week.